Hi, everybody. Welcome to our event tonight. I'm Sammy, the Squarebooks event coordinator. With me, I have Tom Franklin and Ashley Blooms, and we're going to talk about Ashley's book, Every Bone a Prayer. First, some upcoming event announcements. Tomorrow at 5 p.m. Central, Jill McCorkle is going to be in conversation with Lisa Howarth to talk about her book, Hieroglyphics. We're super excited about that. On Friday at 5 p.m. Central, we'll be having virtual happy hour with Alice Randall and Caroline Randall Williams to talk about the book Black Bottom Saints. We're having a cocktail sponsored by St. Leo, so that's going to be really cool and a lot of fun. And then next week on the 26th, we have Tiffany McDaniels with the book Betty, and she's going to be in conversation with our bookseller Al Morse, and that will also be at 5 p.m. Central. So I am going to let Tom and Ashley introduce themselves, and I will be back when it's time to do the Q&A. So if you have questions for Tom and Ashley, you can go ahead and start putting them in the chat box. And that's it from me.
Well, thanks, Sammy. Hi, everybody. I don't know who's here and who's not here. I see there are names, but Jennifer Key, hi. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me okay? Well, I will quickly introduce myself, and then Ashley will introduce herself, and we'll go from there. My name is Tom Franklin. I'm a writer who lives in Oxford, Mississippi, and I teach in the MFA program at the University of Mississippi, along with my wife, Beth Ann Fennelly, who's here with her mother-in-law, Mariana. And one of the great privileges of my job is I get to meet young writers like Ashley Blooms. And I met her when she came into our program, and she was immediately engaging and interesting, fun. She wrote really unusual fiction. She wasn't afraid to go with like werewolves or things like that. It's quite a brave writer. And I guess I've kind of actually wandered into introducing Ashley, so I'll stop talking now. But anyway, this is how I met Ashley. Ashley?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Blooms. I'm originally from Cushing, Kentucky, but I'm currently living in Berea, Kentucky. I attended the Ole Miss MFA program from 2014 to 2017. My debut novel, Every Bone a Prayer, is actually the thesis novel that I wrote and defended to get my MFA. My short fiction has been in fantasy and science fiction, Strange Horizons, and others. And I have an essay that was published in the Oxford American. I think that kind of covers most of it. I think I'm going to start with a little reading from the book. So here's the beautiful book. This is actually the first time I've gotten to read from it since everything was a little odd and got shifted around a little bit due to COVID. So I'm excited to share a little bit with y'all. This is from the second chapter. So in the first chapter, we meet the main character, Misty, and there's sort of a hint that maybe she has something special or different about her. And this is the first time that we get to see her use that ability. And she's at the creek right now beside her house. Beneath her were minnows and crawdads and tadpoles. There were copperheads and cottonmouths slicking along the grass on the bank. There were bluegill not far away, small for their age, because the creek was a small place, and it was hard for any creature to outgrow its home. The fish stayed small because they had no room to get bigger, and because they were small, there was always just enough to go around, enough food, enough light, enough water, and they all got to go on living, if not growing. But it was the crawdads that Misty came for, the crawdads that kept her coming back. They seemed small and murky brown at first, but up close the crawdads were a wash of colors. Their arms stained wood smoke blue with a muddy green along their 8 trembling legs, their backs speckled with small dots the color of old lace, a yellow that still remembered what it felt like to be white. They were small enough to fit inside Misty's palm, most of them 4 or 5 inches long with thin legs and 2 large claws at the end, which always seemed to be opening and closing, always searching for something to hold on to. Misty spoke to the crawdads as she stood in the creek, though she never opened her mouth. Some words weren't made for speaking, not by tongues like hers, so small and flat. So she called out from inside herself instead. It was easy. Her mother had taught her how to pray when she was 5 years old. She'd knelt beside Misty on the threadbare carpet and said, "Now open up your heart. It's more listening than saying anything, but you can ask for things too. You open up and wait for God to speak to you. Close your eyes now. Close your eyes." So Misty listened to her mother, and she listened for God. Her chest, a door flung wide open, her heart, the golden light spilling onto the floor, eating the darkness whole. She invited everything inside. But instead of God, Misty heard the mouse living in the walls of their trailer. The mouse showed Misty the tangled nest she'd made for her children from the torn scraps of the science folder Penny had lost the week before. The mouse filled Misty's nose with the scent of mothballs and her bones with the hum of the pipes in the walls. The mouse showed Misty what it felt like to be a mouse, furred and quick and small. Eventually, with practice, Misty got better at reaching out to the world. She learned that everything had a name. Not the name that most people knew them by, but something different, an underneath name made of sounds and memories and feelings, a name that shifted and grew and evolved. Some things had many names, and some had only one. Some things had names that she couldn't speak inside herself. They were so long with age, so heavy with time. Misty had a name too that lived beneath and beside her other name all the time, and this name was long and twisting, filled with memory and sound. She could choose parts of her name, selecting the memories or moments she held closest, but other parts were beyond her control. The crawdads had tried to explain it to her once, how names were made from things remembered and lost, things passed down from generations before, and things that the body knew that the mind forgot. Sometimes she understood how names worked, but sometimes she still wasn't sure. But she knew that in order to speak to the world, she had to offer her name, like holding out her hand, one half of a bridge built between her and everything else. The crawdads could respond with their name and join Misty, sharing thoughts and memories and feelings. Misty knew what it felt like to be small and clawed and slick. She knew the safest places to hide during squalls when the creek swelled with water and the current threatened to tear the crawdads away. She had seen the pictures the crawdads etched into the sand with their tails in the deepest parts of the creek, messages like prayers that the minnows carried downstream. She could smell an oil spill and an eddy, and she had felt the weight of eggs gathered on her belly, and she had molted with the crawdads 100 times. And she knew all of this because the crawdads knew, and they shared it with her. They shared themselves.
Thank you, Ashley.
Just imagine the applause.
Well, thank you. Well, listen, if it's okay, I'll ask you a few questions about the book, and then we'll take questions from this beautiful gallery of faces and names.
Perfect.
First, would you just, you were saying earlier that the idea for this came from a story that you wrote in Kiese Lehman's workshop. Can you talk about where it came from the story form to the novel that we have here today?
Yeah. So it was a story that I'd always wanted to write. I knew that I wanted to write something that sort of dealt with or dove into childhood trauma, especially, and childhood sexual abuse. And it was something that I'd wanted to write, but I was never entirely sure where to begin. And I took Kiese's workshop, and the wonderful thing about Kiese, for anyone who's worked with him, is that he really creates this really open, caring environment in his workshops. And so I think because he was there and because the workshop group was such a good mix of people that I felt sort of brave enough, courageous enough to really try my hand at it. And so I wrote a short story that was from William's point of view, who is a little boy in the book. And I turned it in and it went really well. But it still felt like something wasn't quite finished, but there was more for me to say, especially from Misty's point of view. And so it was that was in 2015 that I turned that story in. And in 2016, I started working on the novel itself. And it went through a lot of different forms because I drafted like a first draft of a novel before, but I'd never taken it through like full revision, editing, all of that. And so I was still very young and untried at novel writing. So I was just kind of stabbing in the dark. And it started out, my initial idea was a collection of sort of linked short stories from multiple perspectives of the characters in the book. And I got through, I think, a semester working on that. It wasn't quite working. And so I boiled it down to 3 characters, all 3 of whom still appear in the book. But it's only from Misty's sort of a close third perspective to Misty. And I worked on that through 2016, 2017. I defended it as my thesis. And I really kind of set it aside after graduate school. And I wasn't sure if I was going to go any further with it. And I applied to the Clarion Writers Workshop right after grad school, and I got in. And it's a science fiction and fantasy workshop intensive kind of boot camp that takes place out in California. It's been around for decades, and it's a really wonderful place. And so I went immediately from graduate school into a writing boot camp and ended up working on short fiction there. And I turned in the first chapter of the book in the very last week at Clarion, because I wasn't ready to let go of it yet, but I wasn't ready to fully commit to it either. And I got such lovely feedback again that I was like, well, maybe I'll stick with it. And then a friend from the MFA program, once I got back home, Sarah Huddleston, she told me that Dorothy Allison was going to be teaching at the 10 House Winter Workshop in 2018. And she was going to be doing a novel mentorship as well, where you could submit your novel to her and have her read it. And I was like, well, if there's anyone on the earth that I could hand this book to, I think it would be her. And so in fall of 2017, I went back at it again. I took it from 3 perspectives down to 1. So did a massive edit in like a month, which was I wouldn't recommend it, but it got the job done. And I got into Tin House, and I got the novel mentorship with Dorothy. And so the winners, it was like January of 2018, I met her and got to work with her, and she read the book. And she was just so incredibly supportive and kind, and offered such great feedback, and really buoyed my confidence in my belief that this was just a book that was worth holding on to and continuing to work on, because it was not an easy book to write or to revise or to send out into the world, but she really helped give me that last push. So I made yet another round of edits on it, which was pretty substantial, and I ended up going on submission for agents that year, and I got an agent in I think summer of 2018, and she and I went through about 7 months of edits on the book. And I give you all this just in case there's writers in the audience who are listening who know that it's a long arc between this. So, don't get discouraged anywhere along that, because it was 7 more months of edits with my agent, who is fantastic. She's a very editorial agent, so she likes to get like elbow deep into the book, which is exactly what I want from an agent, is someone who's going to work with me. And we went on submission with it in, I think it was March of 2019. And this was when I was still living in Oxford, and I got the call about the offer like the week that we moved away from Oxford. And all the deal was signed and everything in July of last year. And they gave me the publication date in August. So it was 1 year from signing to the book being here.
Amazing. The book has a real, magic realism quality to it. Would you talk about that? The decision to go in that direction. What can that say about people that normal realism can't say about people?
Yeah. So, part of the answer is that that's just what I've always been drawn toward writing. I'm not afraid of werewolves. I'm not afraid of vampires and angels. I'm not afraid to really put anything in there. So that was just always the kind of stories that I've been drawn to. I grew up, watching X-Men and X-Files and lots of genre movies. I was always a big fan of horror, like scary movies. And so that was just the largest part of what I consumed. And so it was always just the most natural thing to include those elements in my work. And then specifically with this book, and I think with a lot of what I write about, is how trauma impacts characters. And for me, it may seem not like a natural relationship, but for me, experiencing trauma in itself is a very disruptive, fracturing force, right? So trauma and living with it in day-to-day life, if like I have PTSD, and so some of the things that I've experienced sort of growing up and dealing with this has been very surreal. Trauma can cause flashbacks, which are like this odd form of time travel that we can experience, right? You can literally be transported back to a moment in time. You can even see and hear and feel the things that are happening in that moment, even when you're 10, 20 years away from that occurrence, right? And trauma, it distorts so many things and so much of your bodily experience. And so writing a book about a little girl who's experiencing that, there are ways in which using disruptive elements, so genre elements, statues that grow out of fields, green lights that appear on walls that no one can figure out where they're coming from, the sort of odd, bizarre things, are better at capturing like an authentic depiction of what it is like to live through and experience trauma than some of the realistic elements are. So for me, like if I want to really create that experience, if I want to capture what it is like, then the strange, the surreal, the magical become some of the best tools that I have for doing that.
Which is not to say that the real world isn't there and real and current throughout. Setting, it plays such an important part in this novel, and I admire the setting so much. Talk about how you incorporate realistic setting into a book like this.
Yeah, so the book is sort of a blend, right? It's kind of like a split. It still very much contains a lot of everyday things, right? The little girls play outside, they go to church, they go and visit their aunts, they go four-wheeler riding with their cousins. So you see like all these very sort of normal, realistic things. And for me, the magic and the strangeness, I kind of try to look for sort of like cracks in a sidewalk, right? So it's places where it can kind of creep up through there and always interact with, but never technically like overshadow or overcome the realism. To me, they're really intimately twined. And I also try to look for ways that the character can kind of, their experience can kind of come out in the magic or in the surrealness. So like with Misty's mother, this green light appears in the house and she can't figure out where it's coming from. And she's going through a separation from her husband. There's these strange things that are happening around her. She's suddenly become a single mother. She's the one responsible for the two girls. She's incredibly stressed out and worried. And for her, that green light becomes this thing that she can kind of fixate on. And it's this way that if she can just stop it, if she can find a way to get rid of it, then she can protect her children. She can be okay. She can do this on her own, right? It becomes this fascination or obsession that is really sort of a corollary to the emotional experience that she's happening. And so it's sort of how can the surreal and the real kind of interact and entwine in those moments to really get at the truth of that emotional experience.
I think you also develop characters wonderfully. Can you talk about the relationship between Misty and her sister, Penny? I love their complicated relationship.
Yeah, I love writing families. That generally tends to be what I go for and I tend toward. And sibling relationships are particularly fun to write, honestly. And so Misty and Penny, writing them was one of the most joyful parts of the book. And they're two very different little girls. So Penny is 12 and Misty is 10. And Misty is sort of more quiet and meek and apologetic, whereas Penny is more brash and stubborn and loud, right? And so from the beginning, we see them kind of going through their mother and father separating, and they have two very different responses to that, right? And those two very different responses and ways of existing in the world are going to cause friction between them, and that's what ends up happening, right? And so we see them kind of, to me, what is like the natural progression of sibling relationships is a lot of like pulling apart and coming together, pulling apart and coming together. There's always something that you're just so irritated and frustrated about this other human being that you have to share all your space, all your resources, all of your time with. And you're so different from one another, but you're so bound to each other in all these ways that are really hard to name, especially I think when you're young. And so for Misty and Penny, that's really what happens is they sort of, because of the way they respond to things, get pulled apart and are at odds with one another for a large part of the book. But it's also Penny who notices that something is wrong with Misty and that tries her best to be there for Misty, even if it's not in a way that necessarily works. And it's Penny who I think becomes one of Misty's biggest advocates and protectors in the end, because she is so close and does notice so much about her sister and is able to be there for Misty. And I think probably the most vital moment. And so we get to see hopefully the full range of it. I don't like any relationship that's too saccharine or too sweet. And I like to see the natural conflict that arises between people, even people who love each other.
And speaking of that, these two have a wonderful extended family, with aunts and cousins. Talk about, if you will, these ancillary characters.
Yeah. So I grew up with a pretty big extended family, especially like in my childhood. There were always aunts and cousins at my granny's house, and we were just always at granny's house. And so a lot of fiction that I've read doesn't, I think, take full advantage of the beauty that are cousins and the beauty that are loudmouth aunts who get too involved in your business. The fantastic things that happen when your family sort of extends and you get sort of those different perspectives on sort of the family, you know, like even with your aunts or cousins, like they can function so differently than your home. And so that's sort of like was my first image of the way that other people worked in the world and what other families looked like, was my aunts and uncles and cousins. And so Misty has 2 aunts that she's particularly close with, and sort of a little smattering of cousins that she ends up spending a lot of time with. And their relationship is one of the sweetest, I think, between Misty and her cousins. There tends to be this sort of, I think it highlights this kind of generational shift between the aunts and uncles and Misty, sort of the adults in the family, and this sort of cluster of cousins who are coming up a little bit younger. And you see them relating to each other in different ways that we don't really see among the adults. And you see this real honesty and tenderness kind of unfold between them. There's this real acceptance of each of them because, you know, one of her cousins is trans, one of her cousins is queer. And so you see this real love and acceptance of each other over here, whereas some of the forces around them, right, some of the religion, some of the gender roles, some of the things that are sort of more oppressive to them. So it kind of creates this little pocket where Misty can feel safe. And it's her relationship to them and her tie to them really ends up being a very important part of her sort of journey back to herself, is that connection to her family, that feeling of love and acceptance that she gets from them.
The book has something that hadn't seen before on it. It has a trigger warning in an author's note at the beginning. Would you talk about your decision to do that?
Yeah.
Do you not think that's a spoiler? Of sorts?
Yeah. So I knew that I wanted to include trigger content warnings pretty early on. It was pretty important to me. And I was lucky to have my agent and editor be very supportive and sort of fully behind me including that. And it really comes out of my experience as someone with PTSD, and sort of, I think there's some confusion and maybe there's not enough clarity around what trigger warnings actually do, like their actual function. I think a lot of people see them as a way that helps people avoid things that they just don't want to talk about or just don't want to see, when really trigger warnings in my life have actually allowed me to engage more than if I didn't have them. So one of the examples I like to give is that when the horror movie Hereditary came out, I was super excited to go see it because I love scary movies. But I couldn't really tell from the trailer what was going to happen. And unfortunately, horror likes to sneak in things sometimes, like sexual assault, physical assault. So horror can just be rife with these things that can be really triggering. And so I waited until the movie came out, and I found a synopsis of it online, and I read through it. So I read everything that happened. And that night, my partner and I, Sam, we went to watch the movie. And if there was a moment in which I thought, I just don't want to see that, I was able to turn my head and then turn it back because I knew what to anticipate. And that's the beautiful part of trigger warnings, is that without them, I would not have felt confident enough going to see that movie and knowing that I would not be triggered in some way. But because I got to read that synopsis, I was able to know exactly what I was going in for. And I was able to just glance away, but still get the point of the movie and not have to miss out on anything. And I was able to fully enjoy it because I wasn't worrying about something triggering, sort of slipping in when I wasn't expecting it. And that's one of the things about trauma that often causes the trauma. Like that's one of the roots of it, is that lack of autonomy. It is that loss of control. And trigger warnings are really beautiful because they give that autonomy back to the person who is engaging with something. They say, here's everything that's going to happen. You get to decide now if you're comfortable with that. If you need to skip a section or skip a chapter, then that's fine, right? If that's what helps you still be able to read this book and go into it safely, knowing that you can engage with it and not harm yourself in some way, then that's really the point of it. It's a way for me to welcome readers in. And in the letter in the front of the book, it says, I don't know what you're carrying. I don't know what you've been through, but here are some things that happen in this book that might be harmful if you engage with it. So, it just gives them the chance to decide what's right for them. And some people have asked me, like, aren't you afraid that you won't sell as many books because of this? Like, if someone sees that it has something upsetting, then they may not buy it. But I'm perfectly okay with that. I don't want to build a career or a future or a life on selling books at any cost. I want people to feel respected and cared for when they come into my books. So that's what the trigger warnings are kind of part of, is welcoming people in and letting them make the right choice for them.
Well, you care for your readers beautifully with the gorgeous sentences in that book. It is wonderful. And now I'd like to ask Sammy if you would, she's going to invite questions from the rest of you. I've asked
Hey, y'all, I am still waiting on some questions, so go ahead and submit those to me. While we wait, Ashley, are you working on any new projects right now?
I am. Yeah, that's actually what's on the wall over here. If you can see all these weird multicolored things happening over here. That's actually the outline for my second novel. I didn't outline the first book, and it all worked out okay in the end, but I definitely didn't want to go through as an extensive of an editing process on the second book if I was able to sort of avoid that. So up on the wall is essentially like a 3-act plot structure with a second act that's been split into 2 parts, and all the little multicolored cards, that's just construction paper that I cut into little squares and taped up on the wall. But every color represents either a character or a plot point or a theme or something that's really prevalent in the work, because that's often how I see my work, as sort of these little threads that kind of get woven together. And so having it outlined in a very visual way lets me sort of see, if a red card suddenly hasn't appeared for 4 acts, it's suddenly dropped away, that maybe I need to remember that character or that perspective that I left out. But that's my second. It's a standalone, so it's not related to Every Bone of Prayer, but it's an adult novel. It'll be coming out from Sourcebooks. I'm not sure, since I'm still in the midst of working on it. But it's similar, I think, to Every Bone of Prayer, and that it does have sort of magical or surreal elements in it. But this time it's told from a first-person perspective of a young woman in her mid-20s. So I'm still literally right in the thick of it, so I don't want to talk too much about it, but I'm excited to be working on something new.
I love how color-coded it is.
Actually, you said it's an adult book. Do you consider Every Bone of Prayer not an adult book?
I do consider it an adult book.
Okay, me too.
There's been some confusion. I think there's some because of the age of the protagonist, but it was written for adults. But I do think that it has some sort of crossover as far as ages. I do think that older teens can read the book and engage with it, especially like in a discussion group. I think that it's a book that really benefits from being talked about with other people, that there's a lot there that I think is really great to sort of talk about with others. But yeah, definitely adult. So is the next one. Although I do plan on writing middle grade, one of my great dreams.
Okay, so our first 2 questions are pretty similar. I'm going to combine them. It's about how you're writing through your own personal trauma and the difficulty of that. What our viewers want to know is, how did you take care of yourself? How did you engage with joy and hope while you were doing so? And yeah, just basically, how did you keep yourself safe when you were writing these parts?
That is a great question. And the answer is, honestly, I didn't do a very good job of it when I was writing this book. It's something that I think I was still learning how to do. I'm doing a much better job of it now in writing the second book than I did the first time around. I think I have a sort of dogged work ethic that has kind of defined my life. I grew up in poverty. And so there was just always just like work, right? Move. Like I didn't give myself a lot of breaks or a lot of breathing room in general with whatever I was working on. And that held true for Every Bone of Prayer. And so I definitely did not treat myself as kindly or lovingly as, when I look back now, I should have. But for this new book that I'm working on, I definitely take a very different approach. Even working on a deadline, that my publisher has, there has to be in my head knowing that it is okay to ask for more time, knowing that it's okay to take days off that I'm not writing. And it can be hard when I take days off because, I'll still feel guilty for not working. And then technically I'm really not taking a day off even when I am, because that weight and sort of worry is sort of looming over it. So I don't really fully rest. And so learning how to really rest, how to step away and not feel bad, and know that taking those breaks, taking days where I just rewatch old shows that I love, or go for long walks, or listen to music, right? Whatever I'm doing when I'm not writing, that's still part of writing, that it's still part of my process, and it's part of taking care of myself. And the books don't get made if I'm not there. So I have to sort of take care of myself. And I definitely think in the writing itself, one thing that I did well with Every Bone of Prayer was I did look for joys, especially within the book itself. That's one of the things that's really important to me as a writer who writes sort of heavier topics, is that to never lose sight of the joy and excitement and love and beauty that also exists alongside of the darkness or the sadness or the trauma. I think there's sometimes traumatic stories will often get lauded in a different way than other stories do in our literature. They will get focused on. And I think that it goes like doubly for certain groups. I mean, as a woman, a poor woman, queer woman, all of these things, I definitely think that I feel that, but also Black writers and other writers of color, often those are the stories that will kind of get plucked out and will make it. And so there becomes this pressure to kind of write into your pain, that's really the most valuable thing about you, is all that you have survived. And I really dislike that as a notion. This is what I write sort of naturally. These are the things that I'm drawn toward, but they are not the most important things that happen in a life. And in the book, it was, for Every Bone of Prayer, it was very important. It is about child sexual abuse, but the scenes in which that happen they take up about 7 pages of like a 350-page book. It's a very small portion of the whole. And that was really important to me, because the trauma is not something that or the violence is never something that I want to linger in or glorify or to sort of take up huge amounts of room. Often it's incredibly quick and incredibly fleeting, like traumatic events are, but they have really long echoes. And so to focus, instead of on the things that happen, to focus on how she comes back to herself, how Misty heals, how she connects with people, how she finds her voice and is able to share her truth with the people around her. That focusing on that instead of focusing necessarily on the pain or the hurt is really important, I think, in order to get through writing difficult material, but also thinking just portraying an honest story. Life is hard, but it's also really wonderful. And often those things coincide directly beside one another, which is one of the strange and wonderful things about being alive.
Thank you for answering that so honestly. I know that's a really difficult question, but you expressed yourself so beautifully.
Thank you.
So our next question is from Danny. She wants to know, for the multiple perspectives you are writing from, do you plan to do the short story series that shows the perspective of some of the other characters?
I don't think I would go back to that material, but I have thought about, and it would probably just be something that I did for fun, and like just kind of did for free. I don't know if my agent would agree with that, but I have thought about writing stories from the perspective of the characters after the end of the book. So to sort of catch up with Aunt Jem and see what she is doing, to sort of see what Jerry and Jamie, her cousins, are doing, to see what Penny sort of grows into, to kind of visit them at other sort of important moments in their life, to just kind of check in with them. That's something that I've definitely have ideas about. And these characters, despite the fact that I'm in the midst of writing a new book, the characters in Every Bone of Prayer are still very close to me, close enough to sort of give me ideas. So it's something I've thought about.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more. How has the pandemic affected your expectations for releasing your debut novel?
Yes.
It's a hefty one.
Yes. Honestly, I feel like I was just talking about this the other day. I was like, I think the universe is trying to teach me to let go of expectations. And because expectations are often, at least for me, a kind of anxiety, a kind of like wanting to control the future, wanting to believe that I can make an outcome occur, wanting to believe that I have probably more power than I actually do have, right? Because so much of this is just completely beyond anything that I could do, anything that I can control. And so the pandemic was useful in that way, because everything that I sort of expected is not what's happening. You know, it's a very different release than it would have been in a different world. It's a very different way to come into the world with a book, but it's still been really good. And it's still been like a really wonderful experience, because I mean, the thing that I come back to, like, along with allowing myself to sort of mourn what could have been and wasn't, right, with, you know, had I debuted in a world that wasn't in the pandemic, is also just the reminder that my book is in the world, even this strange version of the world that we are currently in, that it still exists and it is still here. So I think, like I said, I think the universe has been helping me release the need to understand or control or have a clear path. You know, ultimately, I don't really need that to keep doing what I'm doing or to have a great experience.
That's a very optimistic answer. I like it a lot. Okay, so we've got one last question. Ashley, can you talk a bit about your revision process for the novel? What draft version did you get to before you felt pretty good about what you'd written?
The revision process was very long for this novel. Like I said, I didn't outline, so I was very much just kind of running headlong into a novel draft. And once I got it completed, I went through, I think, 2 to 3 more revisions that were pretty substantial. Like, the book was really changing pretty drastically between those revisions. And at the point before I actually submitted it to an agent, I had gotten it as far as I could. It was to the point where I was either like moving periods around, or I was like, maybe I'll just rip out these 8 chapters, right? So it got to this point where I was like, I need to step away from this, because I may mess it up, you know, and I just couldn't see anything else from my, you know, limited perspective that I could do to make it better. And I really needed somebody else other than my partner, who had helped me all along the way, and other friends and writers that had sort of asked for advice. I really needed someone else, an agent, to kind of work with me, to help me honestly see my work more clearly and to see where it needed to go. And so that was the point when I couldn't do anything more without maybe substantially harming the book, that I was like, I just need to trust that it's good enough. And if, you know, if it gets rejected or if I get feedback, then I can kind of move from there. That was the point that I finally started sending it out.
Good deal. Okay, everyone. Well, that's our time. I'd like to thank Tom and Ashley for having such a wonderful discussion. It really was just really moving and really awesome. If you're going to be around tomorrow, Jill McCorkle will be here with Lisa Howarth for Hieroglyphics at 5 p.m. Central. If you'd like to buy a signed copy of Ashley's book, we have those at squarebooks.com. The link is at the start of the chat. And thanks. If you missed any part of this is going to be posted on YouTube tomorrow, so you can check that out as well. Everyone said y'all did great, so very positive feedback. All right, well, that is it from us. So have a great night, everyone. Thank you so much.